Never in the history of the world have the merchants of obscenity, the teachers of unnatural sex acts, had available to them the modern facilities for disseminating this filth.
There is no price for individuality.
People should not be afraid of their governments. Governments should be afraid of their people.
Some people lose their faith because heaven shows them too little. But how many people lose their faith because heaven shows them too much?
Good tidings, my beloved truth seekers. You heard almost all you need to know from the introduction. Welcome to the place where we gather as a pantheon of gods in the making here at the virtual Alexandria. In cyberspace, no one can hear you scream, but no one can light that stake under your feet while we play in the joyous playground of blasphemy.
Nothing can hurt us now. What we have can't be destroyed. That's our victory. Our victory over the dark.
We are the Gnostics, the veterans of 1,000 psychic wars, and the ones who have our third eye open to the masquerade that is reality. We see through the suffering imposed by the Archons, as strong as we see the sparks of light that shine brightly in the darkness that knows it not. And we understand that our mission is not only to liberate, awaken our own spark of godliness, but aid those who are ready to take the final journey across what the Valentinians called the Horus, or border in Greek, into the stillness and rest of the Pleroma.
I'm so afraid of how powerful this is!
We're on a dark odyssey where only a few will taste the ecstatic waters of Gnosis and finally feel sated after so many lifetimes of sandy thirst. Like George Orwell once said, speaking the truth in times of universal deceit is a revolutionary act. And we continue our revolution, for Hypatia started 2,000 years ago. Nobody ever said it would be easy.
You can't compete with me. I always win.
And today, on this Sunday, March 25th, we have a great show with great insights that will hopefully give you a new perspective on the truth of Western history. The victors get to write history, but it's the knowers that can notice the hidden lines written in blood by these same victors. Our guest today is Richard Smoley, author of Forbidden Faith, The Gnostic Legacy, Inner Christianity, A Guide to Esoteric Tradition, Hidden Wisdom, A Guide to the Western Inner Traditions, and editor of Quest Books and former editor of Gnosis magazine, a great publication. You can find information on his many accomplishments and books at innerchristianity.com.
Let me have your attention for a moment.
And I highly recommend his book, Forbidden Faith, The Gnostic Legacy. Not only is an A to Z, a Valentinians to the Matrix book for those virginal in Gnosticism, Richard is one of those rare individuals who can see in between the many lines of history and understand the shifts in factual tectonics. You'll believe this after the interview, my beloved truth seekers. One example is that secularists have always promoted the fact that Giordano Bruno was burned at the stake for saying that the universe was infinite and there were many worlds. He did say that, but Richard uncovers that it was his belief in the Hermetic tradition, in other words pagan Gnosticism, that did him in the end.
We're told to remember the idea, not the man. Because a man can fail. He can be caught. He can be killed and forgotten. But 400 years later, an idea can still change the world.
And of course, secularists want to keep the Renaissance and the Enlightenment Period the domain of the rationalists and atheists. They want to be the victors in history when history has been mostly about victims. Rationalism was just one tool to bring down orthodoxy to the point it lost its political stranglehold on the West. The occult, the esoteric, the hermetical and Gnostic ideas went hand in hand in these movements, much of it culminating in the various secret societies.
You've done remarkable things, but you're fighting a war you've already lost.
There is no coincidence that both Thomas Jefferson and Benjamin Franklin went to the same lodge as Voltaire generations later. It's no coincidence that the Hermetical ideas spread even to the founding of the USA, as Stephen Heller proved in our second program. And this goes back to the theme I've been hammering at you for a while. To get a deeper reality, to experience the universal mind and the oneness, the secular and the mystic must become two great marriages. And this was nothing alien for the great movers and shakers of the Renaissance, the Enlightenment Period, the Cathars and troubadours of southern France, the 60s in California, or any of those oases of great flares of human conscious development. From Socrates to Einstein, there are those that understand that the spirit and logic is a ladder to a higher mind, the nous in Greek, the intellectus in Latin, the Brahman in Hinduism, the Atman in Buddhism, the Satori in Shinto, and the indwelling Christos or Gnosis in Gnosticism. You don't have to divorce logic if you embrace mysticism. In a simpler way, oneness is what we're thriving for and not the segmenting of the human condition.
Just because there are things I don't remember doesn't make my actions meaningless. The world doesn't just disappear when you close your eyes, does it?
But sadly, that is what our modern world has become. A constant tension between the secular and the religious, theists and atheists, and thus it seems there is a vacuum of ideas that lead to numinous truths we once had in other times of history. Alas, I say. But hopefully this show will bring some hope, and some atheists and theists will get the light bulb of Sophia over their eternal, combative brains.
We are star stuff. We are the universe, made manifest, trying to figure itself out.
Let's be real. Most of us have experienced supernatural events. But as soon as they happen, our ego immediately comes to the rescue and finds a way to say, there is no reality but me. I am a jealous reality and there's nothing beyond me. Denial sets in that person who won't budge at the obvious. Something beyond the mundane reality happened.
I made you, and I can break you just as easily.
On the other hand, one can show logic in abundance to a fundagelical, and he will twist his mind like a Circus du Soleil acrobat until he feels comfortable in his own anxious skin. Like the fact there was no historical Jesus, or that the Gnostics and not the Roman Church were the first Christians, or that the concept of hell is a childish evolution that has no place in early Christianity. Alas again.
Oh, a bullshit artist!
And either side understands that science and the supernatural can happen, that as humans our consciousness is still limited, like a dog who goes for a walk but only sees what it wants to see. But like Joseph Campbell said, a dog can live a good life, but it's still the life of a dog. Or as Augustine said, it's not that natural law is violated, it's that our perception of natural law is violated. In centuries to come, walking on water or seeing into other dimensions, even the spiritual ones, might be commonplace, while to us they might seem like magic. And in the end, science or the supernatural, it's all magic depending where you stand, and a miracle. And if you look hard, you'll be rewarded with that esplanade to Gnosis, the knowledge of the heart, that salvific information that frees us from the world of shadows and forms.
What if this is as good as it gets?
But enough of my drivel. Let us not tarry and listen to what Richard Smoley has to say, and says it well. Well, thanks a lot for joining Coffee, Cigarettes, and Gnosis. Definitely a pleasure. What I really liked about your book is kind of the God of the gaps of Gnostic books. You you plug in a lot of holes that a huge majority of Gnostic books have missed, and you do it very well. And at the same time, your book is very approachable for like a lay person who's trying to understand Gnosticism. So in that sense, I really enjoyed your book.
Great. Well, thank you.
What exactly led you to write such an erudite book?
Well, it was a combination of things. I mean, there's certainly a widespread interest in the Gnostic Legacy, and it was kind of a dialogue between my agent and Harper San Francisco originally. This would be back in 2004. They were looking for something that was, kind of a history of Gnosticism, or, what I've called the Gnostic Legacy from, say, the beginnings to the present. And, there are a lot of different threads to follow, and various interconnections and strands that weave in with each other. So it was a very interesting idea, and I was very excited to do it.
Yeah, you actually show one of the first times I've ever seen a comprehensive chart of how everything branches out from the beginning of the Sumerians to the Da Vinci Code or the Matrix. So that was interesting.
Well, it was curious. I mean, it was actually, that idea was the publishers, and someone there said, well, maybe it would be interesting to have a chart of how all these things interconnect. So I drew one up. At first, they were somewhat taken aback by it because they said, it looks like a map of urban sprawl. And I wrote back an email and said, well, the map of the Gnostic Legacy is not like a map of urban sprawl. It's far more intricate and confusing. And even that chart, is to some extent simplified, because, if you start having, things all over the place, you start looking like, the ratings of a conspiracy theorist or something like that.
Right.
But,
yeah.
It was an attempt to, follow some of these threads through. Like, just to take one random example, the greatest scholar of Jewish mysticism in the 20th century was Gershom Scholem. And Scholem basically said, almost in so many words, that the Kabbalah, kind of the central thread of the Jewish mystical tradition, was taken over from Gnosticism, which is really quite a remarkable thing. Coming from a scholar of that magnitude and repute, it really has a lot of weight. Certain scholars have attempted to challenge it, but the grounds on which they've challenged it seem rather weak to me. So that's, just one thread that follows. You can take Gnosticism, and it looks like you can follow it through to the Kabbalah, which looks very different in some ways from the classic Gnostic systems.
We'll get back to the Kabbalah, but I first wanted to start. Could you tell us what the Gnostic spark that began the Renaissance movement was?
You could see it in a number of ways. One was, a key fact was the fall of Constantinople to the Turks in 1453, which meant that a lot of Greek scholars fled west to Italy, which was, although Catholic and they were Orthodox, was still a Christian world. And a lot of these manuscripts found their way west. Moreover, it meant that some other key thing happened, which was that suddenly the West had a number of people who were able to read Greek and to teach people Greek. So these texts became, which had only been known a lot of times in Latin translations, if at all, by the educated world in the West, suddenly, became much more available and accessible. Certainly one of the key texts was what's called the Corpus Hermeticum, which is a collection of Greek texts that are now dated probably between the 1st and 3rd centuries A.D. But at that time, they were believed to have been written by Hermes Trismegistus, a semi-mythical figure who sometimes is associated with the patriarch Enoch, sometimes with the god Thoth of Egyptian mythology, sometimes with Hermes in Greek myth, who's sort of like a founder figure, kind of a fountainhead of original knowledge. And these texts were attributed to him. It was believed that he lived at the time of Moses and may have even been a teacher of Moses. There's a famous inlay at the Cathedral of Siena in Italy, dating from around this period, which says, the translated, the Latin is Hermes Trismegistus, contemporary of Moses. So the idea that this knowledge was somehow as old as the Bible, which of course was considered to be the great sacred text, was mind-blowing. Now, later on, scholars discovered that these texts themselves weren't that old, but the knowledge itself may very well be that old. There's certainly allusions in these texts that suggest that they were an attempt to codify the esoteric wisdom of the Egyptians into the language of the Greek Hellenistic world, because the knowledge of the Egyptians, the Egyptian tradition, was dying. There's a very poignant passage in one of the corpus, one of the Hermetic texts, that says, "Oh, Egypt, Egypt, soon all of your good works will have vanished and all your worship will have perished." And so they knew that tradition was at its last, and were trying to present it in some kind of form that could pass over into the new world of, Greek thought and, eventually Christianity. And those texts, when they were rediscovered in the 15th century by the Western world, certainly constituted one of those sparks that kind of launched much of the interest in the Renaissance. Now, another, I've already mentioned the Kabbalah, but another it was around this time, and I'm talking about the mid to late 15th century, that the Christian world started to become aware of the Kabbalah and the kind of riches of Jewish mysticism. And the first person who really brought this to the fore was an Italian philosopher, nobleman named Giovanni Pico della Mirandola. And he presented a number of works. Some of them, he was sort of studying Kabbalistic texts on his own, sort of trying to present them in the philosophical language of his time, and even went so far to say that Kabbalah itself at its core proved the truth of Christianity. Whether that's so or not, it's certainly the case that interest in the Kabbalah, in the scholars of the Renaissance, was another one of those sparks. And the Kabbalah and these Hermetic ideas were very much part of the intellectual current of the 15th and 16th and 17th centuries. People were aware of them, much the way that, a modern intellectual might be aware of, something like Zen. Even when people necessarily didn't know a lot about it, they knew it was there and, had some general concept of what it was. And it was this, that partly reawakened the intellectual and cultural life of the West, which at that point had begun to get very frozen into a very stiff medieval scholastic philosophy, dominated by the Catholic Church and the philosophy of Aristotle and Aquinas.
Yeah, and I guess one of the, as you mentioned, one of the mistakes is, a lot of people believe that the Hermetical philosophy was actually the Egyptian religion completely, I guess until later on, when archaeology and so forth discovered it wasn't so?
Well, the relation of the Hermetic texts to Egyptian religion is interesting. And this is a question that I don't really feel has been adequately answered by scholarship. If you look at the oldest evidence from the Greeks of Egyptian religion, there seem to be indications of doctrines that, for example, reincarnation, that don't seem to appear in Egyptian religion as a sort of unearthed in the kind of from the sands. It leads me to think that there was an esoteric Egyptian religion that may have been passed down orally, that was kind of even behind and underlying what you would learn about from Egyptian religion, reading from some religion history textbook, or even from archaeological studies. Pythagoras, who brought the doctrine of reincarnation to the West, was the first person who taught it openly. This was in the 6th century BC. Definitely studied in Egypt and learned a lot of things there. For example, the Pythagorean theorem in geometry. People used to think that he invented it, but the Egyptians knew it. It's called that because he was the one who brought it to the Greek world. Wow. And he also brought this doctrine of reincarnation. Strangely enough, Pythagoras had a very curious detail. He had a kind of mystical esoteric school. And one rather odd thing that's never really been explained, or had never been explained until, fairly recently. I have an answer for it. But Pythagoras forbade his followers to eat beans.
Oh yeah, I remember. I fell out of my chair when I read that.
Yeah, and the classical scholars try to explain this, have all sorts of utterly ridiculous theories, but the answer is quite simply, I think, shown in Herodotus, where he says the Egyptians don't eat beans. They kind of regard them as kind of a disgusting food. And Pythagoras probably studied in Egypt. He did study in Egypt. He probably picked up their food taboos, just the way if you go and, study at a Japanese monastery or a Hindu ashram for any number of years, you might well come back as a vegetarian. You've picked up their food taboos, so to speak. So that indicates that a lot of this knowledge that Pythagoras brought in, at a very early phase in the Western civilization came from Egypt. In short, what these esoteric ideas that we see in like the Hermetic texts have to do with ancient Egypt is a very fraught question, and I'm not sure the answers have really been pieced together, nor do I think has anyone really tried to piece them together in a really exhaustive scholarly way.
And moving back just a little bit in time, what exactly are the origins of romantic love and the troubadours as far as you can see?
One theory that was advanced by a French scholar named Denis de Rougemont in a very famous book called Love in the Western World was that romantic love, as we know it, was invented by the troubadours, who elevated love to this, love and kind of put love on a pedestal in a way that had never been before. Put in quite so simple terms, I mean, it's ridiculous because if you go back and read the poetry of the Greeks and the Romans, they knew something very much like romantic love. People fell in love long before the troubadours of the 12th century. So the idea that they invented romantic love, although you hear this idea kind of repeated over and over again because de Rougemont came up with it, on the face of it is nonsense. I think what it is fair to say is that the troubadours and the courts of love at that period in the early medieval, mid-medieval era sort of elevated love itself to kind of a central point in human life, and love in its romantic form as well as its, kind of coarser forms. Certainly the Christianity before that had found love to be very, very central, but it wasn't really quite, there's certainly talk of love in Christianity before that, but it was never really brought to the center, even though it's kind of implicit in the Gospels. It's really only at this time that love became kind of deified. You can say, you just turn on the radio, love is all you need. All you need is love, Every song, every banal pop song you ever heard, has these very conventionalized phrases of love, praises of love that are so familiar that they're almost meaningless to us. But the fact that this is done, the fact that this is sort of in the background of our culture and we sort of have absorbed it, like it or not, is due to this impulse from the troubadours and from the courts of love in medieval times.
Right, so basically the troubadours didn't invent it, but more than likely revived the old classical notions of, eros and higher love together. I
mean, they kind of, in a sense, put love on a pedestal in a way that it probably never had been put before. And there were lots of different aspects to it. One of it is sort of the sublimation of sexuality. Everybody knows that, if you, a desire that's satisfied, it kind of, cools off a little bit. But if you have some, woman that you're adoring from a distance and, kind of never really get to see her or touch her, this kind of emotional frenzy, keeps at a very high pace, and it provides a kind of strange emotional excitement of its own weird ecstasy.
Like Dante had for Beatrice.
Well, that's exactly it. I mean, Dante, was like, I don't know, he was 12 years old or something. He sees this 9-year-old girl at a party, and he sort of falls in love with her, and he sees her, in person maybe a half dozen times, she dies very young. So there's no idea that he's, going to marry her or settle down and, have babies. He marries somebody else that he, in fact, never writes about. I don't know what Dante's wife felt about all this writing about Beatrice, but, probably nobody asked her. So there's this very, kind of conscious, almost division of love into this kind of very highly idealized love that's never realized, and kind of the ordinary sort in which you kind of get married to whoever and have babies, and the wife has to run the household and that sort of thing. So these were two kind of very, very different types of love. De Rougemont, in that book that I talked about, points out, with I think some reason, that if you kind of had this ideal of courtly love, this ideal lady of your dreams that you never see, it's going to set you up for being disappointed with ordinary relationships. And he thinks that a lot of the tragedies of love, not only the literary tragedies, but the tragedies of love we see in everyday life, are the result of this kind of break made by the troubadours. It's an interesting issue, and it's definitely worth exploring. Our attitudes toward love are extremely strange in a lot of ways, and some of it is probably due to these impulses from medieval time, as well as Christianity itself, which, has always tended, from the very, very earliest stages to demonize physical love and to idealize non-physical love.
Yeah, and you criticize the Gnostics for doing the same thing throughout the book.
Yeah, well, I mean, this is kind of this strange thing. I mean, the Gnostics, believed that the world was, if not fundamentally evil, at least fundamentally problematic. If the world is that much of a mess, you can kind of take two fundamental approaches to it. One is you can, attempt to cut yourself off from it in any sort of way and sort of stop it. It's like there's a sect in one of Jorge Luis Borges' stories who, it's a fictional sect that he mentions, who forbade both mirrors and sexual intercourse to its followers because they both multiplied illusions. And so one is to kind of cut yourself off completely from it. And some of the Gnostics did this. They were quite ascetic. The Cathars of the medieval times, who were, part of the Gnostic legacy, were, if anything, as much or more ascetic in their celibacy than the Catholics of the time. The other is to take a kind of antinomian, libertine approach. That is to say, well, if this world is a mess anyway, and it's all kind of the creation of, this second-rate deity called the demiurge, in a sense, what does it matter if you do down here? So you might as well do what you feel like doing.
Like the Carpocratians, basically.
Yeah, I mean, the Carpocratians were accused by their enemies of having these licentious orgies in which, semen and menstrual blood were consumed as sacraments. It's very hard to say. Like a lot of the Gnostic sects, you have to be very, very suspicious about information that's, comes through the guise of their enemies. Is it overstated? Is he just, citing rumors? It's very hard to say. We don't have any evidence from Carpocratians themselves. And, certainly if you're criticizing and denouncing these religions, it goes without saying you're not going to try to present them in their best light. And you will naturally, distort and exaggerate their worst features. On the other hand, people do, people have used semen and menstrual blood as some, magical substances. They contain a certain kind of vital charge that many other types of substance don't have. So could the Carpocratians, could they have done this? Yeah, they could well have. We just don't know.
Richard, moving further into the murky waters of secret societies, you point out that the Rosicrucians consider themselves Gnostic Christians. What exactly was Gnostic about them, or were they just taking a name and running with it?
I don't know any any, at least with the kind of the early Rosicrucian texts, that they make any reference to Gnosticism. There are, I think in my book I said that there's, some critics of the Rosicrucian movement in the 17th century said, well, this is nothing but the heresy of the Gnostics, up to date, updated. What they did have, I think, was this, if you wanted to say there's a central theme, a central thread in the whole Gnostic legacy, it's the desire to know something for yourself rather than just taking it granted because the church told you so or it says here in the Bible. It's a desire to kind of investigate experientially, the truths of religion. And I think the Rosicrucians certainly had that in them. And in that sense, they were, the heirs of the Gnostics as well. One of the things they talked about, the Rosicrucians, just to kind of, provide a little background, the Rosicrucian movement in its kind of earliest origins is rather mysterious. There are a couple of very short tracts written around 1610 called the Fama Fraternitatis, the Rumor of the Brotherhood, and the Confessio Fraternitatis, the Confession of the Brotherhood. And it told this story about this semi-mythical figure. We don't know if he existed, or most likely he was a fictionalized or somewhat allegorized figure of a real person who we don't know very much about, named Christian Rosenkreuz. And this Christian Rosenkreuz went to the east, meaning in those days Palestine and North Africa,
right,
to learn, the mysteries of knowledge, and he came back to Germany and he taught them. And one of these things that he taught, and one of the things these texts talk about, is, in a sense, reading the book of nature. That is to say, to look into nature and explore it for yourself, rather than just relying on what Aristotle and Galen, Galen was a Roman physician whose books on medicine were still the textbooks, of the time. In those days, to study science was to read the physics of Aristotle and the works of Galen. Nobody did any experimentation. The Rosicrucians were part of this movement and said, well, hey, let's look at really what's going on. Let's really look into the secrets of nature rather than just trusting what Aristotle and Galen said. So there, too, there's part of that theme of wanting to know something for yourself and to know it directly and experientially rather than, just because somebody said so a long time ago.
Another one of your God of the Gaps, which I was pretty flabbergasted, is that you mentioned that both Descartes and Sir Francis Bacon were influenced by the Rosicrucians.
They were definitely part of that movement. And, Descartes, to this day, is sort of regarded as like this hyper-rationalist. People talk kind of the scientific worldview as the Cartesian worldview. And there's certainly that element in Descartes' thought. The idea that he was very interested in these ideas, that he went from France to Bohemia, today's Czech Republic, to find the Rosicrucian brothers, is sort of overlooked. And the typical conventional scholar finds all the stuff that I've just talked about, all of these threads, very embarrassing. I mean, this is all occult nonsense. This is all fringe stuff. The real tradition of the West is this hyper-rationalism that, started with, Socrates, if you like, and sort of continued, and although there were centuries and centuries of darkness and superstition and all, various surfacings of this occult nonsense, reason, and kind of some, in the sort of way that, some materialistic philosopher today would think of reason, as the only true Western tradition. Well, obviously this is rubbish. More and more, even scholars themselves are having to admit this, because these esoteric currents were so powerful, particularly in the 17th century when modern science as we know it was being born. The Rosicrucian movement produced, among other things, one of its kind of children was the Royal Society in England, in London, which was kind of one of the first scientific societies to have been founded in the Western world, and, still exists. Today, it's a very hyper-conventional scientific society, but in those days, it was very much aligned with the esoteric movements. So, ironically, science is the child of these occult movements of the, 16th and 17th centuries, but it doesn't want anything to do with it. It's like, it's like some kid who, goes off to college and is ashamed, when his parents come to visit. That's the way it is, but that's, history is strange.
Is there a connection between the Rosicrucians and the Freemasons?
Yeah, this is sort of debated. What I'll give you is sort of the most, widely accepted scholarly view, which is that the Rosicrucian movement in the early 17th century, which produced these tracts that I mentioned earlier, wasn't so much a specific secret society as kind of a series of currents of people who were interested in Hermeticism, in the Kabbalah, in various forms of occult philosophy, including alchemy. These movements started to become connected with these lodges, which originally started in Scotland, and they were originally Masons' lodge, literally stonemasons' lodges that, had some version of esoteric wisdom. And these two kind of combined and produced what's known as, Freemasonry, which is no longer, by the time you kind of see it really starting to surface in the 1640s and 1650s, is no longer, a stonemasons guild. At that point, it's sort of a society in which people can, well, for one thing, there's certain, mystical ideas, esoteric ideas that are buried in its rites and rituals. Another thing that it produced was a strong emphasis on religious toleration. Like one of the earliest meetings of the Freemasons' lodges, it's recorded in the diary of an Englishman named Elias Ashmole, who was one of the founders of the Royal Society. I think it's in 1646. He writes, I was there. I was initiated in this lodge, and he lists the number of these people, and it turns out, well, he was an Anglican. He was on a high Anglican on the side of the king. There were these Puritans there. There was a Catholic. And this was at the height of the English Civil War, when, that is to say, the Anglicans on the side of the king and the Puritans were, killing each other. They were large, pitched battles. And the idea that these people could get together and meet in peace and, toleration and security was itself a revolutionary thing. And it was from those Masonic impulses that, what we think of as religious toleration, what we think of as, representative government, eventually arose. So there were, those currents that, kind of flowed. Just one other kind of sideline about the Masons is that in medieval times, there were these guilds, which were something like, they were a combination of kind of professional organizations, beneficial societies, trade unions. They had a lot of different functions. Insurance companies even, because they provided benefits for their members if, somebody got hurt or died. And they did have certain esoteric teachings in them. And the stonemasons guilds were one of these. And kind of they provided a kind of framework, to build what we think of as now, Freemasonry on. But they weren't these stonemason guilds weren't the only trade that had this kind of knowledge. Many of the others did, and in France, some of these still exist. They're called the compagnonnage, which are there's no real translation. That is to say, they're kind of guilds with esoteric knowledge. Some of them are even quite strange. Like in Italy, one of the esoteric lodges was for a trade known as the charcoal burners, because people would burn. There was a people made a living burning wood and turning it into charcoal. These were called the Carbonari, and they surfaced in Italy in another form in the early 19th century as a political movement that was aimed at unifying Italy. And incidentally, breaking the back of the church as a political power, because in those days the church still owned a good chunk of Italy, ruled it directly.
Yeah, you mentioned one person who was responsible for it and who was able to unite Italy. I forget the name of it.
Oh, Garibaldi.
That's him. Yeah.
Yeah, and he was connected with that movement. He was also, head of the Masonic. He was sort of head of the Masonic Lodge in Italy. So, and then, the Catholics have always hated the Freemasons, and, they've had reasons for doing so, because the Masons were kind of the force that really broke what was left of the political power of the church, in the 18th and 19th centuries. The church didn't like it. I mean, today, you'll see Pope Benedict XVI say, well, the church, it's not his sphere to dictate political life. And he does say that in a recent encyclical. But that wasn't what they thought in those days. And they only think it now because the power was taken away from them.
Right, but it's still, you can't be Catholic and a Freemason according to the Catholic Church to this day.
No, and the Freemasons aren't thrilled about it either, because it is, well, you belong to this religion, and they don't want you here, so you're not even really being loyal to your own religion, are you? Now that is fairly recent now. I mean, or not recent, but it started in the 18th century. I think the first papal bull against Masonry was issued in 1738. Before that, there was no problem. Like when I said Elias Ashmole had a Catholic in his lodge, that's because in 1646 it was okay. The Catholic Church had no problem with it. It was only 100 years later. Now, I'll tell you a thing. I didn't put this in the book because I didn't have any documentation for it, but I will throw it out as a piece of hearsay.
Wonderful.
The opposition of the Catholic Church to Freemasons has always been a bit nebulous. But it's sometimes said in Masonic circles, and I'm not a Mason myself, that the reason the Pope came down so hard on it was that the Pope himself wanted to become a Mason, and they were perfectly happy to have him. But in the lodge, they said, you're equal. You're not the Pope here. You're just another man like everybody else. And Pope, being, what he thought he was, just wouldn't go for that. They got very mad and condemned the Freemasons. Now, I don't know that that's true. I've never seen any documentation of it. It has a bizarre ring of truth to it, to me. And it explains a little bit more about, the hostility of the church to Masonry. Because, in Masonry, no, we don't recognize the church. We don't recognize your ecclesiastical privileges. You're a man here like everybody else. If you're used to going around having your rings and toes kissed, you're probably not going to like that.
Yeah, very true. And moving up a little bit further, this is a view that Stefan Heller also agrees with. But why was the discovery of the Pistis Sophia in the 19th century so vital for the esoteric movement of that time and afterwards?
Because it suggested that these esoteric ideas really went back to the earliest years of Christianity. And it helped confirm what people had long suspected and believed without a lot of hard evidence for doing so, which was that there was a kind of a secret doctrine in Christianity that had been lost or covered over. Now, what's interesting about the Pistis Sophia and many of the other Gnostic texts is they have one curious feature in common. They all present Jesus as giving these teachings after his resurrection. I think the Pistis Sophia says that Jesus was around for 11 years after his death and taught his disciples. Right. And whether, again, this is so in a literal sense or not, it does point to, what I think something that is profoundly true, that all the kind of exoteric teachings in the Gospels that Jesus delivered, shall we say, when he was alive in the flesh, literally or figuratively, are kind of the outermost court. And that after one is, shall we say, literally resurrected, from the rest of the disciple is literally born again in some real sense, and not just, having, just going down and shouting Jesus at the end of some revival meeting. If you have some real awakening of, shall we say, the true self, these ideas come into play, and they look very different in certain respects from the exoteric teachings that, Christianity is, publicly promulgated.
Right, and this was certainly fuel for the Theosophical Society through J.R.S. Meads, and I think even Madame Blavatsky was very fond of the Gnostics.
Yeah, well, Madame Blavatsky, was, operating in kind of the late 19th century, essentially saying, well, the true Christianity, that embodied the hidden wisdom, is the religion of the Gnostics. And this was a very shocking thing to say at the time, and probably in some circles it still is, because the Gnostics were always sort of the arch heretics. They were always what Christianity in its kind of orthodox form had defined itself against. And to say that this was the real thing was mind-blowing. And, it just totally turns its head on kind of all of church history and doctrinal history and that sort of thing. But that's, of course, because of, whoever wins gets to write the history.
Exactly.
The Orthodox Catholic Church, in a sense, won the political struggle. The Gnostics were suppressed or died out in kind of late antiquity. And, their story was never really heard except kind of accidentally. This Pistis Sophia text was emerged, this Englishman finds it in some, London junk shop, which, nobody knows really where it came from. The Nag Hammadi scriptures, which have attracted so much attention over the last generation, were dug up by an Egyptian peasant who was just digging up some fertilizer. In a sense, is the survival of these things is either accidental or providential, depending on how you want to look at it.
Right, I like to think of them as providential. It's time.
Yeah.
Another thing, speaking of the Nag Hammadi, is another big point is that you mentioned that the Elaine Pagels, the Gnostic religion, was just important as the Nag Hammadi library in bringing Gnosticism to light. Could you explain that?
Yeah, she gave, her Gnostic Gospels, and published, I think it was in 1979, was kind of the first clear presentation of Gnosticism to a literate reading public. The previous work, kind of standard works on the subject, were pretty dense, and she presented these ideas in a very clear way. She also suggested, in a very creative and persuasive way, how the triumph of Christianity and certain Christian doctrines was as much political as anything. For example, to go back to the kind of central thread, Gnosis is about finding out for yourself.
Right.
Gnosis is seeing, knowing in some kind of deep sense. And if you know in some deep sense, well, what do you need the church for? What do you need the priests for? Well, you don't need them, or certainly don't need them in the way you used to, which is not, very helpful for, the priest's point of view, what they're trying to earn their living. So what Pagels pointed out is that as the church started to create its own very extremely effective and very flexible organization, it wasn't eventually it did literally take over the Roman Empire. It had to do so from a different basis, and what it used was apostolic authority. And the apostolic authority was from these people, these several individuals who had supposedly seen Jesus after he was resurrected. And in a sense, if you hadn't been one of those people or one of their followers, you really had no authority, even if you knew something on your own. And that kind of crucial shift from wanting to see and know things from oneself to seeing and knowing something on received authority, was what separated ultimately the Christian church as we know it today from the Gnostic movement. And for the most part, people are lazy. People don't necessarily want to know. Or, I got my bills to pay. I got my, I just as soon take it all in kind of a package form from somebody else. And so the church is going to be much more appealing on a widespread popular basis than the insights of the Gnostics, which are difficult and elusive. Not necessarily because they put them in an obscure way, although they often did, but, to see these things happening in oneself is pretty subtle and pretty, it requires a lot of introspection, a lot of inner work and inner sifting that most people just don't want to bother with. Today is, just as much as, in 100 AD.
Yeah, and I guess lastly would be, which kind of connects to this, is using your crystal ball. What is the state of the union of Gnosis or Gnosticism today? Where do you see it going?
Well, I don't see the Gnostic religion being revived in any sort of, obvious conventional sense. There are Gnostic churches and that kind of thing, that they'll be there. They certainly have as much right to be there. I don't think it will take that form. I think Gnosis and Gnosticism are going to have to be, well, I guess from my point of view, I would say much more cognitively oriented. And what I mean by that is that if you take the classic Gnostic systems, there's this demiurge who's like this second-rate deity. There are these archons who serve as kind of barriers between the individual spirit and its union with the higher realms, and taken literally, these things are very kind of cumbersome. But I think what they're pointing to is that these archons, this demiurge, are in a sense kind of part of the deep-seated structure of our minds that we have to overcome. The demiurge could be roughly equated with the ego. It's all about me.
Right, very true.
The archons are kind of, shall we say, different levels or categories of experience by way of which we, filter things. What do I mean by that? Well, in the Hermetic texts, at one point it portrays the ascent of the soul through different spheres, and these are the spheres of the 7 planets. And at each stage a soul passes through, it loses the vice associated with that planet. Venus, for example, would be lust. Mars would be anger. And if you take those vices, shall we say, lust, anger, lying associated with Mercury, pride associated with the sun, so on, so on, so on, as basic things that condition our awareness of our experience. And if we see our spiritual progress as kind of letting those things go, releasing ourselves from them in some kind of basic way, the ideas of the Gnostics and the Hermeticists start to seem much clearer and also more practical. So the archons are, in a sense, not, these kind of nasty archangels somewhere up in the ionosphere, but, very much deeply embedded in our own minds and in which the way we see the world. A lot of our, basic perception of the world is, kind of friend or foe, something you desire, you go toward, something you dislike, you go away from. And this is a very, very deep, instinctual, kind of second-by-second basis. And these are the archons, and freeing ourselves from these, I think is what the true message of the Gnostic legacy is all about. Some might say that the Gnostics just sort of projected all of this out into the kind of elaborate system that they themselves didn't understand, almost in the way, one might have a dream. Jung, I think, would have argued that. I'm not so sure. I suspect that they did really understand something like what I've just been talking about. They put it in this very obscure language in these texts because it was, in a sense, secret knowledge. It was very, in a sense, kind of hard to handle. And so the Gnostic student would read the text, and someone who actually knew what they were talking about would explain them to him or ask him to experience them for himself. The knowledge is not even all in the texts. It's sort of, the texts are only kind of points of departure. You can see something very similar if you, like a typical Tibetan master today might, teach a text. There's kind of some basic, skeletal thing there that he expounds, and you're supposed to absorb it and digest it, from his exposition of the texts. But I suspect what the Gnostics were really doing with those, the Pistis Sophia and the Nag Hammadi scriptures and so on.
Right, they were dealing with the issues of consciousness, reality, and individuation, basically.
Exactly.
More than these supernatural events. But I think that's all the time we have today, Richard.
Okay.
Wish we could talk more because your book is just so filled with information in such a short time. But hopefully we can have you on, and thank you very much.
Well, I really appreciate it. Thank you very much for asking me on.
And there you have it, my beloved truth seekers. Richard Smoley on a king's feast of facts about the real history behind the lying pens of the victors. And this is only a fraction of his book, Forbidden Faith, the Gnostic Legacy. Again, please visit his website, innerchristianity.com, for more of his books, information, and sapience. The truth will set you free sometimes, but it will also scald you like Brad Pitt did to Edward Norton in Fight Club. God hates you and made us all orphans, but that's not the worst thing that could happen. Sleeping our way through lifetimes in false realities and never being ourselves is the true hell on earth. I'd like to conclude with an excellent commentary by my friend and brother Nathaniel Merritt. It's about the difference between Orthodox Christianity and Gnostic Christianity. I hope it helps you draw those lines that your ego sometimes blurs with its honey mirages. It's still easy to distinguish between a Gnostic and a Christian. A Christian is an unquestionable believer. A Gnostic questions everything, especially religious dogmas. A Christian believes what they're told to believe. A Gnostic stands upon the ground of their own inner sight and knowing. A Christian makes a handy battle axe wielded by every petty despot who commands them to kill. A Gnostic lives by the Sermon on the Mount. A Christian will kill or die over a single word in a creed, a mere abstraction that exists nowhere except in the Christian mind. A Gnostic knows there isn't a shred of divine reality in any or all words. A Christian is an abject worshipper of a petty, irrational dictator God. A Gnostic vows to no God except his or her innate divinity. A Christian has a God no greater than human shell of a man, a God easily comprehended by the human mind. The inner divinity of the Gnostic is limitless. A Christian believes myths to be actual events that took place on the stage of history. A Gnostic sees and understands that such myths are symbols of a mythic inner journey and transformation. Yes, it's still easy to tell a Christian from a Gnostic. We are the Gnostics. We have set the controls to the heart of the sun, the heart of enlightenment. I am, and I am Abraxas. The road is ended, the song is over. Thought I'd have something more to say. But don't cultivate any troubles, my beloved true seekers, because like heaven above you, the spy that loved you, I'm keeping all of your secrets safe with me tonight. Hello and goodbye as always.
Because we do not know when we will die, we get to think of life as an inexhaustible well. And yet everything happens only a certain number of times, and a very small number, really. How many more times will you remember a certain afternoon of your childhood, an afternoon that is so deeply a part of your being that you can't even conceive of your life without it? Perhaps 4 or 5 times more, perhaps not even